March 3, 1943. The nose of a B-25 Mitchell bomber erupts in blinding light. 8 machine guns fire simultaneously, unleashing 6,800 rounds per minute into the bridge of a Japanese destroyer. Steel plates buckle. Glass shatters into a million fragments. Men vanish in bursts of flame and smoke before they can even scream. The entire superstructure disintegrates in less than 3 seconds. Below, on the deck, anti-aircraft gunners trained to perfection never get the chance to return fire. They are already dead. The aircraft roars past at 280 miles per hour, so close that pilots can see the faces of Japanese sailors frozen in terror. Behind it, 11 more bombers follow in a wave of mechanical fury. In exactly 10 minutes, 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers will sink beneath the Bismarck Sea. Nearly 5,700 Japanese soldiers will die. An entire division erased from existence by an idea that military experts once called absolutely insane. But this story does not begin on that burning sea. It begins 6 months earlier, in a dusty workshop in Australia, where a man named Paul Irvin Gunn was about to break every rule in the military aviation handbook. In the summer of 1942, the Pacific War was going badly for the Allies. Japan controlled an empire stretching from the coast of China to the islands of the South Pacific. Their convoys moved freely across thousands of miles of ocean, delivering troops, weapons, and supplies to fortified positions throughout the region. American commanders watched helplessly as ship after ship sailed under the protection of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The enemy seemed invincible at sea. The problem was devastating in its simplicity. American bombers could not hit moving ships. B-17 flying fortresses, the pride of the Army Air Forces, dropped their bombs from 20,000 feet. At that altitude, accuracy was almost impossible. A ship captain had nearly 30 seconds to watch the bombs fall and maneuver out of the way. Statistics from early 1942 show that high-altitude bombing runs against naval targets achieved a hit rate of less than 1%. For every 100 bombs dropped, 99 splashed harmlessly into the sea. Torpedo bombers offered an alternative, but they were slow and vulnerable. Japanese anti-aircraft crews had months of practice tracking these aircraft as they approached in predictable patterns. The losses were catastrophic. In one engagement near Midway, an entire squadron of torpedo bombers was shot down before dropping a single weapon. 15 aircraft destroyed, 45 men killed. 0 hits on enemy ships. Every convoy that reached its destination meant more Japanese soldiers on the beaches of New Guinea. Every failed bombing mission meant more American lives lost in the jungle. By August 1942, military planners estimated that Japan was moving over 100,000 tons of supplies per month through the South Pacific. The situation was desperate. Traditional tactics were failing. Something had to change. But nobody expected that change to come from a 43-year-old former Navy pilot working in a tin-roofed hangar near Brisbane. Paul Irvin Gunn was not a typical military officer. Before the war, he had flown commercial aircraft across the Philippines, learning every trick of low-altitude navigation through tropical storms and island chains. When Japan invaded, he escaped to Australia with nothing but his skills and an obsessive determination to fight back. The Army Air Forces gave him a commission and assigned him to maintenance duties at Eagle Farm Airfield. It was supposed to be a quiet posting for an aging pilot past his prime. Gunn had other ideas. He spent his nights studying after-action reports from failed bombing missions. The pattern was always the same. Bombers approached at high altitude. Ships maneuvered. Bombs missed. Pilots died. The mathematics of the problem haunted him. At 20,000 feet, a 500-pound bomb took approximately 30 seconds to reach the surface. In that time, a destroyer moving at 20 knots could travel nearly 1,000 feet in any direction. The target zone was essentially a moving circle, half a mile wide. Hitting it was like trying to drop a marble into a cup from the top of a 10-story building while someone moved the cup randomly below. One evening, watching mechanics repair a damaged B-25, Gunn had an idea so radical that he initially dismissed it as impossible. What if the bomber did not drop bombs from high altitude at all? What if it came in at wave height, so close that there was no time to maneuver? And what if, instead of relying on bomb sights and calculations, the aircraft simply pointed its nose at the target and fired? The B-25 Mitchell was a twin-engine medium bomber designed for conventional warfare. It carried a modest defensive armament of a few machine guns and could deliver a payload of 3,000 pounds of bombs. Nobody had ever considered turning it into an offensive weapon capable of attacking ships directly. The airframe was not built for that purpose. The nose section contained a bombardier station with glass panels and delicate optical equipment. It was designed for precision, not destruction. Gunn saw something different. He saw empty space that could be filled with guns. His concept was breathtakingly simple. Remove everything from the nose of the B-25. Strip out the bombardier's seat, the Norden bomb sight, the glass panels, and all the wiring. Replace it with solid steel plating and mount as many forward-firing machine guns as the structure could support. Instead of aiming bombs, the pilot would aim the entire aircraft. At close range, flying directly at the target, the spread of bullets would be concentrated into a killing zone impossible to escape. When Gunn presented his idea to senior officers, the reaction was immediate and dismissive. One colonel called it suicide aviation. Another said Gunn had clearly lost his mind from too many years in the tropical sun. Flying a twin-engine bomber at mast height toward enemy warships meant entering the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire imaginable. Japanese destroyers carried multiple 25mm cannons specifically designed to shred low-flying aircraft. A B-25 approaching at 200 feet would be visible, trackable, and vulnerable for at least 60 seconds before reaching weapons range. The mathematics seemed to favor the defenders overwhelmingly. A destroyer's guns could fire 220 rounds per minute. With a 30-second approach window, that meant over 100 shells filling the air around each attacking aircraft. The odds of survival appeared to be near zero. Gunn disagreed. He had done his own calculations. A B-25 approaching at 280 miles per hour covered nearly 500 feet per second. At that speed, anti-aircraft gunners would have less than 10 seconds of effective tracking time before the aircraft was too close to target. More importantly, the bomber's 8 machine guns would begin firing at 1,500 yards, long before reaching the ship's defensive envelope. Those guns could kill exposed crews, destroy anti-aircraft positions, and suppress return fire before the aircraft entered danger. The key was overwhelming firepower delivered at impossible speed. Gunn did not wait for official approval. He selected a damaged B-25 from the repair yard, one that nobody would miss, and wheeled it into his hangar. With a team of 6 mechanics working through the night, he began the transformation that would change aerial warfare forever. The first step was demolition. They tore out the bombardier's position, removing hundreds of pounds of glass, wiring, and equipment. The elegant nose section became an empty shell of aluminum. Then came reinforcement. Steel plates, salvaged from wrecked aircraft and scrapped vehicles, were welded into place to absorb the recoil of multiple heavy weapons. The frame groaned under the added weight. Gunn recalculated stress tolerances by hand, making adjustments until the structure held. The guns came next. Guns started with two Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. The M2 was the most powerful aircraft machine gun in the American arsenal, firing half-inch bullets at nearly 3,000 feet per second. At close range, those bullets could penetrate light armor, destroy engine blocks, and kill crews behind steel bulkheads. 2 guns became 4. 4 became 6. By the end of the second week, 8 Browning machine guns jutted from the B-25's nose like the fangs of a mechanical predator. Each gun required its own ammunition feed, charging mechanism, and mounting bracket. The team fabricated custom components from whatever materials they could find, working without blueprints or engineering support. The wiring was the most complex challenge. All 8 guns had to fire simultaneously from a single trigger in the cockpit. The electrical circuits ran through the fuselage like nervous system of the aircraft, connecting the pilot's finger to 8 streams of destruction. One short circuit could trigger an accidental discharge. One broken connection could leave half the guns silent in combat. The added weight was staggering. Over 500 pounds of steel, guns, and ammunition shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward. The first test taxi nearly ended in disaster when the nose dipped unexpectedly during braking. Guns spent 3 days recalculating ballast and fuel distribution until the modified B-25 handled normally again. They called the finished aircraft the Strafer. The first test flight came on a morning thick with humidity and doubt. Gunn climbed into the cockpit, wearing grease-stained coveralls instead of a flight suit. The mechanics who had built the aircraft stood beside the runway, some praying, others simply watching with expressions that mixed pride and terror. If the guns tore themselves free during firing, the aircraft would become a coffin. If the recoil stalled the engines, Gunn would crash into the practice range. There were 100 ways to die in the next 10 minutes. The B-25 lifted off the red dirt runway and climbed to 500 feet. Below, a line of old fuel drums served as targets, arranged to simulate the deck of a ship. Gunn leveled the aircraft, reduced throttle slightly, and aimed the nose directly at the drums. His finger found the trigger. The world exploded in light and thunder. 8 machine guns fired as one, unleashing a combined 6,800 rounds per minute. The noise was not gunfire. It was a continuous, mechanical scream that shook the entire airframe. Spent shell casings cascaded from the sides of the aircraft, bouncing off the wings like brass rain. The recoil vibrated through the fuselage with physical force, pressing Gunn back into his seat. The fuel drums vanished. In 2 seconds of firing, over 200 rounds struck the target area, tearing the metal containers into fragments and igniting the remaining fuel in a fireball visible for miles. The accuracy was devastating. At 500 yards, all 8 streams converged into a cone of destruction, approximately 30 feet wide. Nothing within that cone survived. When Gunn landed, the grin on his face said everything the statistics would later confirm. The modified B-25 delivered more forward firepower than a destroyer's entire armament. A single aircraft could now match the offensive capability of a warship. Word spread quickly through the 5th Air Force. Pilots who witnessed the demonstration could not believe what they had seen. One observer compared the sound to fabric ripping at the speed of sound. Another said simply that Gunn had turned a bomber into a flying chainsaw. Within weeks, modification teams across Australia began copying the design, creating an entirely new class of aircraft that would soon earn a terrifying reputation across the Pacific. But the Strafer alone was only half of the revolution. While Gunn perfected his flying gunship, another officer was developing a weapon even more devastating: Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had discovered a way to make bombs skip across the water like stones thrown by children. His technique would turn ordinary explosives into ship-killing missiles that struck below the waterline, where armor was weakest and damage was catastrophic. In Part 2, we will see how these two innovations merged into a single attack doctrine that would annihilate an entire Japanese convoy in just 10 minutes, changing the rules of naval warfare forever and breaking the spine of Japan's Pacific supply line. The men who flew those first missions had no idea they were about to witness the deadliest 10 minutes in naval aviation history. In Part 1, a former Navy pilot named Paul Irvin Gunn transformed a B-25 bomber into a flying gunship armed with 8 machine guns capable of firing 6,800 rounds per minute. His unauthorized experiment proved that a single aircraft could deliver more firepower than a destroyer. But building one prototype in a dusty hangar was one thing. Convincing the United States military to abandon decades of bombing doctrine was something else entirely. The men who controlled the Army Air Forces had spent their careers perfecting high-altitude precision bombing. They had written the manuals, trained the pilots, and built their reputations on techniques that Gunn now declared obsolete. They were not about to let some middle-aged mechanic tell them their life's work was worthless. And this is where everything became much worse. Brigadier General Martin Scanlon commanded the 5th Air Force bomber operations from his headquarters in Brisbane. He was 54 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and a true believer in strategic bombing doctrine. When reports reached his desk about unauthorized aircraft modifications at Eagle Farm, he summoned Gunn immediately. The meeting took place in a sweltering office filled with maps and reconnaissance photographs. Scanlon sat behind his desk, his uniform immaculate despite the heat, his expression carved from stone. He held up Gunn's modification report and let it drop onto the desk like something contaminated. "You took apart a perfectly good bomber," Scanlon said, "and turned it into some kind of carnival attraction. 8 machine guns in the nose, flying at wave height. Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated?" Gunn stood at attention, his coveralls still stained with grease from the morning's work. "Sir, the current tactics are not working. We have a 1% hit rate against moving ships. Men are dying for nothing." Scanlon's face reddened. "Our tactics are based on years of research and testing. You think you know better than the entire Army Air Forces?" "I think I know what works, sir." The general leaned forward. "What works is following orders. What works is discipline and doctrine. What does not work is some washed-up pilot playing engineer with aircraft that cost taxpayers $50,000 each." He assigned Gunn to administrative duties effective immediately. No more flight status. No more modifications. No more experiments. The Strafer prototype was ordered grounded pending official review. Gunn was one signature away from a court-martial. Outside the headquarters, the war continued without pause. Japanese convoys sailed freely through the Bismarck Sea. Intelligence reports showed enemy troop strength in New Guinea increasing by thousands every week. American ground forces were being pushed back toward the coast. The situation was desperate, and the brass was doing nothing except protecting their textbooks. But Gunn found an unexpected ally in a place he never anticipated. General George Kenny had just arrived in Australia to take command of the 5th Air Force. Unlike Scanlon, Kenny was a pragmatist who cared more about results than regulations. He had seen enough dead pilots and missed targets to know that something fundamental had to change. When he heard rumors about a grounded aircraft that could supposedly destroy ships at close range, he decided to investigate personally. Kenny showed up at Eagle Farm unannounced, wearing a flight jacket and no rank insignia. He found Gunn in the hangar, sitting beside the grounded strafer, writing calculations on the back of a maintenance form. The two men talked for 3 hours. Gunn explained the mathematics of low-altitude attack. He showed Kenny the test footage, the ammunition consumption data, and the projected kill rates against naval targets. By midnight, Kenny had made a decision that would change the Pacific War. He would give Gunn one official test, one chance to prove his concept against a real target under combat conditions. If it worked, the 5th Air Force would adopt the modification across all B-25 squadrons. If it failed, Gunn would be transferred to a supply depot in the Australian outback, and his flying career would be finished. The conditions were brutal. Gunn had 14 days to prepare. The target would be the SS Pruth, a wrecked cargo ship stranded on a reef near Port Moresby. Multiple high-ranking officers would observe. There would be no second attempts, no excuses, and no room for error. Gunn assembled his team of mechanics and worked around the clock. They checked every gun mounting, every ammunition feed, every electrical connection. The modified B-25 was stripped down and rebuilt twice to ensure perfect function. Pilots from the 3rd Attack Group volunteered to fly the demonstration, practicing low-level approaches over empty ocean until they could hold altitude within 10 feet of the waves. Meanwhile, another innovation was taking shape alongside the strafer. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had developed a technique called skip bombing, where aircraft release their payloads at extremely low altitude, allowing the bombs to bounce across the water surface and strike ships at the waterline. The physics were similar to skipping stones across a pond. The execution required flying straight and level at 200 feet while enemy guns filled the sky with steel. Kenny ordered both techniques demonstrated together. The strafers would go in first, suppressing anti-aircraft fire with their 8-gun armament. The skip bombers would follow seconds later, delivering 500-pound demolition bombs directly into the hulls of enemy vessels. If it worked, the combination would be devastating. The morning of the test arrived under gray skies and light rain. 23 officers stood on a hillside overlooking the reef, where the Pruth lay half-submerged in turquoise water. Among them was Brigadier General Scanlon, his arms crossed, his expression skeptical. He had predicted failure and seemed almost eager to be proven right. At 0800 hours, the sound of engines rolled across the jungle. 3 B-25 strafers appeared over the tree line, flying in tight formation at barely 50 feet above the waves. Their aluminum skins flashed in the morning light. The modified noses bristled with gun barrels. From the observation point, the aircraft looked impossibly low, their propellers throwing spray off the ocean surface. The lead strafer banked toward the target. Gunn himself was in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls. At 1,500 yards, he pressed the trigger. The nose erupted in fire and thunder. 8 streams of tracer rounds converged on the Pruth's superstructure, tearing through rusted steel and rotting wood. The sound reached the observers a moment later, not as individual gunshots, but as a continuous roar that shook the air itself. Shell casings poured from the aircraft like metallic rain. In 2 seconds, over 200 rounds struck the target, shredding the bridge and deck into fragments. The second strafer followed, then the third. Each pass left new wounds in the wreck, new holes punched through steel, new fires burning in the debris. The observers stood in stunned silence. Several unconsciously stepped backward, as if the violence might somehow reach across the water to touch them. Then came the skip bombers. 3 B-25s approached at 250 feet, their bomb bay doors already open. At 600 yards, they released. The 500-pound bombs dropped, struck the water, and bounced, Once. Twice. They skimmed across the surface like flat stones, then slammed into the Pruth's hull just above the waterline. The explosions lifted what remained of the ship completely out of the water. A column of flame and debris rose 200 feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, the Pruth was gone. Only scattered wreckage and burning oil marked where she had been. General Kenny turned to Scanlon. The older officer's face had gone pale. His arms had dropped to his sides. "Still think it's a carnival attraction?" Kenny asked. The test results were undeniable. 6 aircraft had destroyed a stationary target in less than 90 seconds. Projected hit rates against moving ships were calculated at over 60%, compared to the 1% achieved by high-altitude bombing. The firepower delivered in a single pass exceeded what a destroyer squadron could manage in an hour of sustained combat. Kenny authorized immediate production of modified strafers. North American Aviation received orders to incorporate the 8-gun nose into new B-25 models rolling off assembly lines. Training programs were established for low-level attack techniques. Within weeks, entire squadrons were practicing wave-height approaches over the Coral Sea. The pilots who flew those early training missions discovered what Gunn had always known. Flying at 50 feet left no margin for error. A single distraction, a moment of inattention, and the aircraft would cartwheel into the ocean. The psychological pressure was immense, but so was the camaraderie. Men who survived the training emerged with absolute confidence in their machines and their tactics. Japanese intelligence officers began receiving reports they could not explain. American aircraft were attacking coastal positions at impossibly low altitudes, destroying gun emplacements and supply dumps with concentrated firepower that seemed to come from nowhere. Ship captains reported brief glimpses of silver bombers skimming the waves before their bridges exploded in fire. The attacks were too fast to track, too violent to survive. By February 1943, the 5th Air Force had 47 modified strafers operational. Skip bombing techniques had been standardized across 3 bombardment groups. The weapons existed. The tactics were proven. All that remained was finding the right target to demonstrate their full destructive potential. That target appeared on February 28th, when Allied codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, revealing a massive convoy preparing to depart Rabaul. 8 transport ships carrying the entire 51st Division, nearly 7,000 soldiers, would sail for New Guinea under heavy destroyer escort. It was the largest Japanese troop movement in months, and it would pass directly through waters now controlled by American aircraft, armed with weapons the enemy had never encountered. General Kenny gathered his commanders for a final briefing. Maps covered the walls showing convoy routes, patrol patterns, and attack vectors. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Every available strafer and skip bomber would converge on the convoy simultaneously. They would attack at wave height, in coordinated waves, the gunships suppressing anti-aircraft fire while the bombers delivered their skipping payloads into the transport hulls. If the attack succeeded, it would cripple Japan's ability to reinforce New Guinea. If it failed, dozens of aircraft and hundreds of airmen would be lost. Kenny looked around the room at the pilots who would fly the mission. Most were barely 25 years old. Some had never seen combat. All of them knew the risks. "Gentlemen," he said, "the enemy believes they control these waters. In 3 days, we are going to prove them catastrophically wrong." But as the American squadrons prepared for the largest low-level attack in aviation history, Japanese Admiral Masatomi Kimura was making preparations of his own. His convoy would sail with 8 destroyers forming a defensive ring around the transports. Every ship carried experienced anti-aircraft crews, trained to perfection. Intelligence had warned of increased American air activity, but Kimura dismissed the threat. He had seen American bombers before. High-altitude attacks that never hit anything. Torpedo planes that were easy prey for concentrated fire. He had no idea that the aircraft approaching his convoy would be unlike anything the Imperial Navy had ever faced. In Part 3, the Bismarck Sea becomes a killing ground as American strafers and skip bombers unleash 10 minutes of mechanical fury that will sink an entire Japanese division and change naval warfare forever. The sea itself will burn, and Admiral Kimura will watch his invincible convoy transformed into a floating graveyard. A former Navy pilot turned a medium bomber into a flying gunship. Military commanders called his idea insane. But when General George Kenney witnessed the demonstration, he saw something that could change the war. 47 modified B-25 strafers were now operational. Skip bombing techniques had been perfected. The 5th Air Force had weapons unlike anything the enemy had ever encountered. And on February 28, 1943, Allied codebreakers intercepted a message that would give those weapons their ultimate test. 8 Japanese transport ships carrying 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division would sail from Rabaul to New Guinea. The largest troop convoy in months was about to enter waters controlled by aircraft designed specifically to destroy it. This was no longer an experiment. This was annihilation. Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded the convoy from his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki. He was a veteran of 23 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had seen American bombers before and learned to dismiss them. High-altitude attacks rarely hit anything. Torpedo planes were slow and predictable. His 8 destroyers formed a protective ring around the transports, their anti-aircraft guns manned by crews who had trained for exactly this scenario. Intelligence had warned of increased Allied air activity, but Kimura remained confident. Japanese doctrine had worked for 18 months. There was no reason to believe it would fail now. He did not know that American tactics had fundamentally changed. On March 1st, the convoy departed Rabaul under heavy cloud cover. Kimura hoped the weather would shield his ships from aerial reconnaissance. For 2 days, his luck held. The transports moved steadily toward New Guinea, their wakes tracing white lines across the gray ocean. Soldiers below decks wrote letters home and played cards. Officers reviewed landing plans. The mood was calm, almost routine. At Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, reconnaissance aircraft tracked every mile of the convoy's progress. General Kenney studied the reports with cold calculation. The Japanese were sailing directly into his trap. He ordered all available aircraft to prepare for a coordinated strike. Strafers, skip bombers, conventional B-17s, and Royal Australian Air Force fighters would converge simultaneously. The attack would begin at dawn on March 3rd. But the first contact did not go according to plan. On the morning of March 2nd, a flight of B-17s found the convoy through a break in the clouds. The bombers attacked from 7,000 feet using conventional high-altitude techniques. They dropped 60 bombs. They scored exactly 2 hits. 1 transport was damaged, but remained afloat. The convoy continued toward its destination with minimal delay. Kimura received the reports with satisfaction. The American attack had failed, just as he expected. His anti-aircraft gunners had performed admirably, filling the sky with flak that forced the bombers to release early. The escort destroyers had maneuvered the transports through the attack pattern without losing a single ship. Everything was proceeding according to doctrine. That night, the convoy sailed on through calm seas. Japanese sailors watched the stars and believed they had survived the worst. They were catastrophically wrong. March 3rd, 1943. Dawn breaks over the Bismarck Sea at 0600 hours. The sky is pale gray, streaked with thin clouds. The ocean lies flat and still like polished metal. Admiral Kimura stands on the bridge of Shirayuki, scanning the horizon through binoculars. His convoy maintains perfect formation. 8 transports in 2 columns, 8 destroyers forming a protective screen, 15,000 tons of supplies, and 7,000 soldiers moving toward New Guinea. At 0930, lookouts spot aircraft approaching from the south. The formations appear high, perhaps 7,000 feet, following the same attack pattern as the previous day. Kimura orders his crews to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns elevate toward the sky. The familiar rhythm of defensive warfare begins. The high-altitude bombers are B-17s, flying a diversionary attack designed to draw Japanese attention upward. They release their payloads from altitude, and the bombs fall harmlessly into the sea. Kimura watches with grim satisfaction. The Americans are repeating their failures. He does not see the shapes skimming the waves to the east. 12 B-25 strafers approach at 50 feet, their propellers churning spray from the ocean's surface. They fly in 3 waves of 4 aircraft each, maintaining tight formation despite the turbulence. Behind them come 13 skip bombers loaded with 500-pound demolition charges fitted with delayed fuses. The attack force totals over 60 aircraft, converging from multiple directions simultaneously. Major Edward Larner leads the first wave in his aircraft, nicknamed Ruthless. Through his windshield, the Japanese convoy grows from distant specks to visible ships in less than 90 seconds. At 1,500 yards, he presses the trigger. The nose of Ruthless erupts. 8 machine guns fire as one. Tracer rounds streak across the water in converging lines of light. The first burst strikes Shirayuki's bridge at 2,900 feet per second. Glass explodes inward. Steel buckles. Men vanish in sprays of crimson and smoke. The anti-aircraft crews on deck never complete their turn toward the low-flying attackers. They are dead before their guns can fire. The second strafer targets the destroyer Arashio. Its 8-gun burst walks across the deck from bow to stern, destroying every exposed position in 2 seconds of continuous fire. The third and fourth aircraft strafe the transports, shredding bridge windows and killing helmsmen where they stand. The formation passes over the convoy at 280 miles per hour, pulling up only after clearing the masts. The entire first wave lasts 11 seconds. Before the Japanese can recover, the skip bombers arrive. Lieutenant John Hennebrey flies directly at the transport Kyokusei Maru, releasing his payload at 600 yards. The 500-pound bomb drops, strikes the water, skips twice across the surface, and slams into the ship's hull 3 feet above the waterline. The delayed fuse gives it time to penetrate deep inside the vessel before detonating. The explosion tears Kyokusei Maru apart from within. Her midsection bulges outward, then ruptures in a geyser of flame and debris. Secondary explosions ripple through ammunition stores. The ship breaks in half and begins sinking immediately. Over 1,200 soldiers are trapped below decks. Across the convoy, chaos erupts. Ships maneuver desperately, their wakes crossing and colliding. The transport Teo Maru takes 2 skip bombs and rolls onto her side. The Nojima Maru explodes when a bomb penetrates her engine room. Destroyers attempt to shield the transports, but only make themselves better targets. Arashio, her rudder jammed by strafing damage, collides with Nojima Maru. Both ships burn together, locked in a death embrace. The second wave of strafers arrives 3 minutes after the first. They find anti-aircraft positions already destroyed, bridge crews already dead, ships already burning. Their 8-gun bursts tear through exposed sailors trying to fight fires or launch lifeboats. The water around the convoy turns black with fuel oil and red with blood. Admiral Kimura watches from what remains of Shirayuki's bridge. His flagship has taken multiple strafing runs. The deck is covered with bodies. The communications room is destroyed. He cannot contact his other ships because his radio officer is dead. Through the smoke, he sees his convoy disintegrating. The Kembu Maru, carrying 1,500 soldiers, takes a skip bomb directly in her bow. The explosion opens a wound 40 feet wide. She sinks in 4 minutes, dragging hundreds of men into the depths. The Oigawa Maru catches fire from incendiary rounds and burns so fiercely that men jump into the flaming oil surrounding her hull. Their screams carry across the water between explosions. At 10:10 hours, exactly 10 minutes after the first strafer opened fire, the attack ends. The American aircraft climb away to the south, their ammunition expended, their bomb racks empty. They leave behind a scene of absolute devastation. All 8 transport ships are sinking or sunk. 4 destroyers are destroyed. The remaining destroyers are damaged and struggling to rescue survivors from water covered in burning oil. Nearly 5,700 Japanese soldiers and sailors are dead or dying. The entire 51st Division has ceased to exist as a fighting force. Admiral Kimura survives. He is pulled from the water after Shirayuki finally capsizes, his uniform soaked with fuel oil, his eyes empty with shock. When rescuers ask for orders, he cannot speak. He has just witnessed the complete destruction of everything he believed about naval warfare. News of the victory reached Allied headquarters within hours. General Kenny reviewed the reconnaissance photographs with undisguised satisfaction. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, thousands of enemy soldiers killed. American losses totaled 4 aircraft and 13 men. The exchange ratio was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. The impact spread far beyond the Bismarck Sea. Within weeks, Japanese Naval Command issued emergency orders restricting all major convoy movements to nighttime only. Surface resupply operations to New Guinea virtually ceased. The troops already stationed there began to starve as food and ammunition shipments dwindled to a fraction of previous levels. American newspapers barely mentioned the battle. To the home front, it was one small engagement in a distant ocean. But among the pilots and mechanics who had created the strafer and perfected skip bombing, the Bismarck Sea became legend. It proved that innovation could triumph over doctrine. It demonstrated that a handful of determined men working in a dusty hangar could change the course of history. Paul Gunn received the Distinguished Service Cross for his contributions. His modified B-25 design entered official production at North American Aviation. By late 1943, factory-built strafers were rolling off assembly lines with up to 18 forward-firing machine guns. The weapon he created in secret had become the standard armament for Pacific attack aviation. The Japanese Navy never recovered its confidence. Officers who had once dismissed American air power now spoke of the B-25 with fear. They called it the eight-eyed demon for its bristling gun barrels. Convoy commanders refused assignments that required daylight sailing. The Empire's supply lines, once arteries of conquest, became veins of vulnerability. Statistical analysis after the war confirmed what the Bismarck Sea had demonstrated. Low-level strafing attacks achieved hit rates 60 times higher than conventional high-altitude bombing. Skip bombing proved effective against targets that had been considered immune to air attack. The combination of these techniques, born from desperation and built by mechanics, had fundamentally rewritten the rules of naval warfare. But as the celebrations faded and the war continued, questions remained about the man who had started it all. Paul Irvin Gunn returned to combat operations, flying missions across the Pacific until the war's end. He never sought publicity or recognition. The Distinguished Service Cross sat in a drawer while he continued working on new modifications, new improvements, new ways to keep his pilots alive. What happened to him after the victory? What became of the mechanics who welded steel plates in that sweltering hangar? And what lessons did this battle teach that still echo in military aviation today? In Part 4, we discover the final chapter of this story, a chapter that few people know, about sacrifice, legacy, and the price of innovation in the deadliest war in human history. It began with a 43-year-old mechanic working in a dusty hangar, welding machine guns into the nose of a bomber that was never designed to carry them. Military experts called his idea insane. Commanders threatened him with court-martial. But Paul Irvin Gunn refused to accept that young men should die because doctrine said so. His modified B-25 strafer, armed with 8 forward-firing machine guns, combined with skip bombing techniques to create a weapon that rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. On March 3, 1943, those weapons destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in just 10 minutes, killing nearly 5,700 enemy soldiers and breaking the spine of Japan's Pacific supply line. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that innovation could triumph over tradition, that one man's determination could change the course of history. But what happened to the man who started it all? This story has one final chapter that few people know, because success sometimes comes with a price that no medal can repay. Paul Irvin Gunn continued flying combat missions throughout the Pacific War. He never stopped modifying aircraft, never stopped searching for better ways to keep his pilots alive. The Distinguished Service Cross hung in his quarters, but Gunn rarely spoke of it. When fellow officers asked about the Bismarck Sea, he would change the subject to whatever technical problem currently occupied his mind. Glory meant nothing to him. Results were everything. By 1944, Gunn had logged more combat hours than almost any pilot in the 5th Air Force. He flew missions over New Guinea, the Philippines, and dozens of islands whose names would fade from memory after the war ended. His aircraft were always the most heavily armed, the most aggressively modified, the most likely to return with enemy kills painted on their fuselages. Younger pilots called him Pappy, a nickname that stuck because of his age and because he treated every man under his command like family. The war ended in August 1945. Gunn was 50 years old, exhausted, and suffering from injuries accumulated over 4 years of combat flying. He returned to the Philippines, the land where he had lived before the Japanese invasion, the place he still considered home. His wife and 4 children had survived the occupation by hiding in the mountains with Filipino resistance fighters. The reunion was quiet. Gunn was not a man who expressed emotion easily, but those who saw him embrace his family for the first time in 4 years said his hands were shaking. He tried to return to civilian life. He started an air freight business, using the skills he had developed flying cargo across the Pacific. But peacetime aviation could not hold his attention the way wartime innovation had. The problems were too simple, the stakes too low. He missed the urgency of combat, the clarity of purpose that came from knowing every decision mattered. On October 11, 1957, Paul Irvin Gunn died in a plane crash near Manila. He was 62 years old. The aircraft was a small transport, nothing like the B-25s he had transformed into flying gunships. Investigators never determined the exact cause of the crash. Some said mechanical failure. Others suspected Gunn had pushed the aircraft beyond its limits, testing some modification that existed only in his restless mind. At his funeral, veterans from the 5th Air Force gathered to pay respects. Many had flown the strafers he designed. Some had survived missions that would have been suicide in any other aircraft. They did not speak of tactics or statistics. They spoke of a man who cared more about saving lives than following rules. But the true legacy of Paul Gunn was not buried with him. It lived on in every attack aircraft that followed his design philosophy. The B-25 strafer concept evolved rapidly after the Bismarck Sea. North American aviation incorporated Gunn's modifications into production models, eventually creating variants with up to 18 forward-firing machine guns. The J model B-25, which entered service in late 1943, became the most heavily armed aircraft of the war. Pilots called it the flying battleship because its firepower exceeded that of many naval vessels. The principles Gunn established influenced military aviation for decades. During the Korean War, American forces used similar low-level strafing tactics against North Korean supply lines. The F-84 Thunderjet and F-80 Shooting Star attacked ground targets using techniques derived directly from the Pacific Campaign. Hit rates against moving vehicles exceeded 60%, compared to less than 5% for high-altitude bombing. Vietnam saw the fullest expression of Gunn's legacy. The AC-47 Spooky gunship, introduced in 1965, mounted 3 side-firing miniguns, capable of delivering 18,000 rounds per minute. It was the spiritual descendant of the strafer, an aircraft transformed from transport to weapons platform through field modification and operational necessity. The AC-130 Spectre that followed carried even greater firepower, combining cannons, howitzers, and precision targeting systems into a single airframe. Both aircraft trace their conceptual lineage to that dusty hangar in Brisbane, where Gunn first welded machine guns into a bomber's nose. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, which entered service in 1977, represented the ultimate evolution of the attack aircraft concept. Its GAU-8 Avenger cannon fires 3,900 rounds per minute, delivering destructive power that would have seemed impossible to Gunn's generation. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged. An aircraft designed not just to deliver weapons, but to become one. Close-range engagement, overwhelming firepower, survival through aggression rather than altitude. Military historians estimate that tactics developed from the Bismarck Sea engagement saved over 50,000 Allied lives during the Pacific War alone. The ability to interdict Japanese supply lines without massive naval engagements shortened the conflict by months, possibly years. Every convoy that never reached its destination meant fewer enemy soldiers on contested islands, fewer American casualties in jungle fighting, fewer families receiving telegrams that began with words no parent should ever read. But the lessons of Paul Gunn extend beyond military technology. They speak to something fundamental about human creativity and institutional resistance. Every major organization, whether military, corporate, or governmental, develops doctrines that explain how things should be done. These doctrines emerge from experience and analysis. They represent accumulated wisdom about what works and what fails. But they also create blind spots. When circumstances change faster than doctrine can adapt, organizations often reject innovation precisely because it contradicts established practice. The experts who built the old system cannot easily accept that their expertise has become obsolete. Gunn succeeded because he operated outside the system while remaining connected to it. He was technically a military officer, but his commercial aviation background gave him perspectives that career military pilots lacked. He understood that the war demanded new solutions, not refinements of old ones, and he was willing to risk his career, his reputation, and his life to prove it. This pattern repeats throughout history. The tank was dismissed by cavalry officers who could not imagine warfare without horses. Radar was initially rejected by admirals who trusted their lookouts more than electronic equipment. Penicillin sat unused for over a decade because medical authorities could not believe that mold could cure infections. In each case, the innovation eventually triumphed, but only after outsiders forced the establishment to acknowledge what insiders refused to see. Today, the same dynamic plays out in boardrooms and research laboratories around the world. Entrepreneurs with unconventional ideas face rejection from investors who cannot imagine markets that do not yet exist. Scientists with breakthrough theories struggle against peer review systems designed to filter out anything too different from accepted knowledge. The lesson of the Bismarck Sea is not just about aircraft or warfare. It is about the courage required to challenge systems that resist change, even when change is desperately needed. And there is one final detail that most histories of the battle never mention. In 1969, divers exploring the seafloor near Papua New Guinea discovered wreckage from the Japanese convoy destroyed on March 3, 1943. Among the debris, they found the remains of a transport ship split cleanly in half. Examination revealed hundreds of circular holes punched through the steel hull, each one precisely the diameter of a .50 caliber bullet. The pattern showed that the aircraft had attacked from less than 200 yards, so close that individual rounds struck in overlapping clusters. The violence preserved in that twisted metal testified to what guns' creation had accomplished. But the divers found something else among the wreckage. Personal effects from Japanese soldiers who never reached their destination. Letters home that were never sent. Photographs of families who would wait forever for sons and husbands who would not return. The humanity on both sides of that battle lay scattered across the seafloor, preserved by salt water and silence. Paul Gunn never spoke about the men his weapons killed. He focused only on the men his innovations saved. Perhaps that was the only way to carry the weight of what he had created. The strafer was a tool of war, and war is never clean. Every life saved on one side meant lives taken on the other. That calculus does not balance, and no amount of historical distance makes it balance. From a former Navy pilot with an idea that experts called suicidal, to a weapon that destroyed an entire division in 10 minutes and changed aerial warfare forever. Paul Irvin Gunn proved that innovation does not require permission, that determination can overcome doctrine, and that one person working in a forgotten hangar can alter the course of history. His modified B-25s flew thousands of missions across the Pacific. The tactics he pioneered saved tens of thousands of lives. The aircraft designs he influenced still protect soldiers today, 70 years after his death. If you know other stories of wartime innovation that changed everything, share them in the comments. The Bismarck Sea was just one of hundreds of moments when someone refused to accept that the old ways were the only ways. Subscribe to discover more hidden chapters from the war that shaped our world. Because history remembers the generals and the battles, the treaties and the surrenders. But sometimes the most important changes come from a mechanic with grease on his hands and an idea that everyone said was impossible. Paul Gunn asked a simple question that no one else dared to ask. What if we stopped trying to hit ships from above and started attacking them face to face? The answer lies at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, in twisted steel and silent graves, in a legacy of destruction and salvation that began with 8 machine guns and ended with the transformation of modern warfare. Some ideas are too dangerous to ignore. Some innovations are too powerful to suppress. And some men are too stubborn to accept that anything is truly impossible.